If you're studying A-level psychology, subscribe. I'm covering the essential topics across AQA, Edexcel, and OCR on this channel. In 1961, an ordinary man sat down in a laboratory at Yale University. He was told he was taking part in a study about memory and learning. Within 20 minutes, he believed he had administered a 450-volt electric shock to a stranger in the next room, a stranger who had gone completely silent. He hadn't, but he didn't know that. And here is the most disturbing part. He was not alone. 65% of people did exactly the same thing. Welcome to A-Level Psychology Decoded. I'm going to take you through the most famous and unsettling experiment in the history of psychology. And by the end of this video, you will know this study inside out. You'll understand exactly why it matters for your exam, and you'll have the key terminology and evaluation points you need, regardless of whether you're taking AQA, OCR, or Edexcel. So let's start from the beginning. Milgram's Obedience Study. What is obedience and why does it matter? So before we get into the experiment itself, we need to nail down two terms that your examiner will expect you to distinguish between clearly. And students quite often mix these up constantly. Obedience. This is when you change your behavior because someone in authority has given you a direct order. A teacher might tell you to sit down. A police officer might tell you to stop. A doctor tells you to take medication. You comply because of the explicit instruction from someone you perceive as having power over you. Conformity. We're going to cover this in a future video in more detail. Conformity is different. With conformity, there are no direct orders. You change your behavior to fit in with the people around you. Nobody tells you to do it. You do it because of the social pressure, not the authority. Now, this distinction is worth remembering. If your exam asks you to define obedience, always include the phrase direct order, an authority figure. Those two phrases are what separates obedience from other types of social influence. Now, why did Milgram care about obedience in 1961? To understand this, you need to go back 16 years to the end of World War II. The Nuremberg trials were a series of military tribunals held between 1945 and 1946 in which Nazi war criminals were prosecuted for crimes against humanity. And here's what struck psychologists in the world at the time. Almost every single defendant used the same defense. They said, "I was just following orders." Adolf Eichmann, the man responsible for organizing the transportation of millions of Jewish people to concentration camps, sat in the dock in Jerusalem in 1961, the same year Milgram began his experiments, and appeared to be, in the words of philosopher Hannah Arendt, utterly ordinary. Not a monster, not a sadist, a bureaucrat, a man who followed instructions. And this gave birth to one of the most important questions in the history of psychology, and it's the question on your slide right now. Are destructive acts the result of monstrous individuals, or can ordinary people commit extraordinary evil simply because they were told to? And that question is what Milgram set out to answer. And the answer he got changed everything. Stanley Milgram was born in New York in 1933 to Jewish parents. The Holocaust was not an abstract historical event for him, it was personal. He studied under Solomon Asch at Harvard, whose famous conformity studies you'll also cover in this series. And Milgram wanted to push the question further than Asch had. Ashka's shown that people would give obviously wrong answers in a group just to fit in. Milgram asks something darker. Would people actually harm another person if an authority figure told them to? Now here's something most textbooks leave out. Before he ran the study on Americans, Milgram originally planned to run it in Germany first. His working assumption, shared by most psychologists at the time, was that Germans had some particular cultural predisposition to obedience that explained the Holocaust. He never got to run the German study because what he found in New Haven, Connecticut, with ordinary American men was so shocking that the German comparison just became irrelevant. Ordinary Americans, ordinary people, the same result. Now the location was Yale University, New Haven, USA, and the prestige of that location matters enormously, as we'll see when we look at the variations. It was from 1961 to 1962, and the aim was to investigate how far ordinary people would obey an authority figure even when the instructions conflicted with their own conscience and moral values. And as this slide notes, this was controversial from the beginning. Before the results were even published, colleagues questioned whether it was ethical to deceive participants and put them under genuine psychological stress. And that debate has never fully gone away. Now, when participants arrived at Yale, they were told they're taking part in a study about the effects of punishment on learning. And this was the cover story, a deliberate deception designed to make participants believe the experiment was about something that it wasn't. And each participant was introduced to another person, seemingly another volunteer just like them. In reality, this other person was a Confederate, someone working with Milgram who was part of the experiment. And this is a crucial term. A Confederate is an actor or an accomplice who pretends to be a genuine participant. And the roles were then allocated through what appeared to be a random draw. The genuine participant always became the teacher. The Confederate always became the learner. And this draw was rigged. The teacher's role was the only role ever available to a real participant. Now, the teacher, your genuine participant, was taken to a room containing a shock generator. This was a large, impressive-looking machine with 30 switches ranging from 15 volts, labelled slight shock, all the way up to 450 volts, labelled XXX. And between those two extremes were labels including moderate, strong, very strong, intense, extreme intensity, and danger, severe shock. The learner, the Confederate, was taken to an adjacent room and strapped to a chair. The teacher could hear the learner but not see them. And the task was simple. The teacher read out word pairs. If the learner answered incorrectly, the teacher was instructed to administer a shock and to increase the voltage by 15 volts with every wrong answer. And here's where it gets psychologically fascinating. If the teacher hesitated or refused to continue, the experimenter, a stern man in a grey lab coat, used one of 4 standardized verbal prods in this exact order. Prod 1, please continue, or please go on. Prod 2, the experiment requires that you continue. Prod 3, it is absolutely essential that you continue. Prod 4, you have no other choice. You must go on. Only if the teacher still refused after all 4 prods was the experiment stopped. And if at any point the experimenter deviated from these prods, the data was discarded. So your key terms here are Confederate, cover story, shock generator, and verbal prods. Make sure you can define each one of those clearly. Now, before I give you the results, here is what the experts predicted. Milgram surveyed psychiatrists, psychologists, and ordinary members of the public before running the study. He asked them, what percentage of participants do you think will go all the way to 450 volts? The psychiatrists predicted that fewer than 1 in 1,000 people would reach maximum voltage. They believed only pathological individuals, people with serious psychological disorders, would be capable of this. Most experts predicted that virtually everyone would stop well before the dangerous levels around 150 volts. And here's what actually happened. Every single participant continued to at least 300 volts, 100%. Not one person stopped before the point at which the learner had gone completely silent, which in itself should have been alarming. And 65%, that is 2 in every 3 ordinary American men, administered the maximum 450 volt shock. The one marked XXX, the one beyond the label that said danger, severe shock. Now, looking at this slide, you can see the breakdown. At 300 volts, 100% was still continuing. By 315 volts, where the learner had fallen silent, 83% continued. At 375 volts, 72%. At 420 volts, 68%. And at the maximum, 450 volts, 65%. Now, what the chart does not show you, and what you should mention in your extended answers to demonstrate genuine understanding, is how the participants behaved during the study. They were not cold or indifferent. Observers reported that many sweated, many trembled, many laughed nervously and dug their fingernails into their palms and begged the experimenter to let them stop. They were in genuine distress. And yet they continued. And this is perhaps the most important finding of all. Obedience is not the same as agreement. These people did not want to do what they were doing, but they did it anyway. And here we can see Milgram predicted fewer than 1% would reach 450 volts. Psychiatrists predicted 1 in 1,000, and the reality is 65% of ordinary American men obeyed fully. So how did Milgram explain what he found? Well, he proposed 2 interconnected ideas. The first is agentic state theory. Milgram argued that when people enter a hierarchical social situation, one where there is a clear authority above them, they shift from an autonomous state into an agentic state. In the autonomous state, you act as a free moral agent. You make your own decisions, you take responsibility for your own actions and their consequences. In the agentic state, you see yourself as an instrument, an agent of someone else's will. Crucially, this shifts your sense of moral responsibility upwards. You're no longer responsible. The person given the orders is responsible, and this is why participants in Milgram's study often said things like, "It's not my fault," or "He told me to do it." They'd entered the agentic state. And this connects powerfully to the Nuremberg defense, where people said, "I was just following orders." In psychological terms, that's a description of the agentic state. And the second explanation is the legitimacy of authority. Milgram argued that obedience is far more likely when we perceive the authority figure as legitimate. That is, when their right to give orders feels earned and valid. This legitimacy can come from their role, their institution, their uniform, or their expertise. At Yale University, the experimenter in a grey lab coat carried enormous perceived legitimacy. The prestige of the institution reinforced the sense that this was a proper, sanctioned scientific endeavour. And we see proof of this in variations. When the study was moved to a rundown office building with no institutional prestige, obedience dropped significantly. And this brings us to one of the most important conceptual debates in the whole of social psychology, and one that comes up across all three exam boards. A dispositional explanation of behaviour argues that what we do is determined by who we are, our personality, our character, our individual traits. A situational explanation argues that behaviour is shaped by the context we find ourselves in, the environment, the social pressures, the authority structures that are around us. And Milgram's results are a powerful argument for situational explanation. The same ordinary people who would never dream of harming a stranger in everyday life administered what they believed were dangerous electric shocks, because the situation they were placed in made it feel normal, expected, and required. The baseline study is only half the story. What makes Milgram's work so scientifically valuable is the systematic variations that he ran, changing one variable at a time to identify exactly which situational factors were driving obedience. And this is brilliant experimental design and worth noting as a strength. In the baseline study called the remote condition, the teacher could hear pre-recorded responses from the learner but had no visual contact. 65% fully obeyed. In the voice feedback condition, the learner's protests were audible and more vivid. Obedience dropped slightly to 62.5%. In the proximity condition, the same room, it dropped to 40%. And in the touch proximity condition, where the teacher had to physically hold the learner's hand onto a shock plate, obedience fell just to 30%. And the pattern is clear and logical. The closer the teacher was to the learner, the harder it became to maintain the psychological distance that was needed to remain in the agentic state. Proximity made the human cost of obedience impossible to ignore. When the study was moved from Yale University to a rundown commercial office building in Bridgeport, Connecticut, presented as a private research firm with no university affiliation, obedience dropped from 65% to 47.5%. And this is direct evidence that the legitimacy conveyed by Yale's institutional prestige was a significant situational factor. Remove the prestigious setting, and the obedience falls. But perhaps the most striking variation of all is when two Confederates, posing as other teachers, refused to continue at 150 volts and walked out of the room, leaving the genuine participant alone with the experimenter. Obedience collapsed to just 10%. The presence of peers who resisted gave participants the social permission and the moral courage to do the same. This finding connects directly to the concept of social support as a factor in resistance to social influence, a topic you would need for both AQA and Edexcel. So when the experimenter wore a grey lab coat, obedience was higher than when he appeared in casual clothing. Uniform functions as a visible symbol of legitimate authority, and it reinforces the agentic state. Well, let's evaluate the study. And remember, in any extended answer, your evaluation needs to be balanced and supported with evidence. The first strength is the controlled procedure. Milgram used a standardized script, fixed voltage increments and consistent Confederate responses across all participants. This means the study has a high internal validity. We can be reasonably confident that differences in obedience between variations are due to the variable being manipulated rather than random differences in procedure. The second strength is replication evidence. Jerry Berger at Santa Clara University replicated a version of the study in 2009, ethically redesigned to stop at 150 volts rather than 450 volts. He found broadly similar obedience rates to Milgram's original findings, which supports the reliability of Milgram's conclusions across time and updated social contexts. Cross-cultural replications in countries including Australia, Jordan, and Germany have also found broadly comparable levels of obedience, which strengthens the generalizability of the findings. Now, the most significant weaknesses, and the one most extensively discussed, concerns ethics. Milgram deceived participants about the true nature of the study, and this violates the principle of informed consent. Participants showed clear signs of psychological distress, trembling, sweating, nervous laughter, and that raises serious concerns about protection from harm. While participants were technically free to leave, the verbal prods created significant pressure to continue, arguably compromising their genuine right to withdraw. And the debriefing process, while Milgram did follow up with the participants, it's been criticised as inadequate given the level of distress that was caused. Against this, Milgram himself argued that the deception was necessary. A fully informed participant would not behave naturally, and that the debriefing restored their psychological well-being. In a follow-up survey, 84% of participants said they were glad to have taken part. The second weakness is sample bias. All participants were male, American, and responded to a newspaper advertisement, making them self-selecting volunteer as a sample. And this raises questions about how far the findings generalize women to other cultures, to people who would not volunteer for a psychological study. And finally, demand characteristics. Some researchers have argued that participants may have suspected the deception and been responding to what they believed the experiment expected of them, rather than to genuine authority. And if this is true, it would undermine the internal validity of the study. One of the most powerful real-world tests of Milgram's findings came just 5 years after his original study. In 1966, Charles Hoffling conducted a field experiment in a hospital setting. A nurse on duty received a phone call from a man claiming to be a doctor, someone she had never met, who instructed her to administer 20 milligrams of a drug called Astraten to a patient. This dose was double the maximum safe amount written on the bottle, and the drug was fictitious. The doctor was a Confederate. 21 of 22 nurses, that is 95%, began preparing the medication before being stopped by a researcher. They were obeying a voice on a telephone. No face, no uniform, no physical presence, just the perceived legitimacy of a doctor's authority. This is Milgram's findings, operating in the real world with real stakes. Jerry Berger's 2009 replication is also worth knowing for 2 reasons. First, it provides modern supporting evidence for Milgram's conclusions. Second, it demonstrates how psychological research can be adapted to meet contemporary ethical standards while still generating meaningful data. A useful methodological point for exam answers about balancing ethics with scientific value. There's also, For OCR students in particular, Milgram is directly relevant to the criminal psychology option. The situational framework he provides helps explain how ordinary individuals can participate in institutional wrongdoing, from prison guard abuse to corporate fraud, without being fundamentally different from anyone else. And this is why the nature-nurture debate matters here. A purely dispositional explanation, blaming individual evil or pathology, cannot account for the scale and consistency of Milgram's findings. A situational explanation does. Finally, let's talk about how to actually use all of this in your exam. Regardless of your exam board, extended response questions in psychology follow the same underlying logic. You need to describe, apply, and evaluate. And you need to do all of these three things very well. Describe means to state what Milgram found and how the study was conducted. Be precise. Include the percentage, 65%. Include the key terms, agentic state, Confederate, verbal prods. Examiners reward accurate technical language. Apply means connecting the findings to whatever the question's asking about. If the question is about situational factors, use the variations. If it's about ethics, apply BPS guidelines. If it's about research methods, discuss internal validity and sampling. Always read the question carefully and tailor your use of Milgram to what is actually being asked. And evaluate means offering a balanced evidence-based critique. Do not simply list strengths and weaknesses. A good evaluation makes a point, supports it with evidence, and explains what it means for the study's conclusions. 4 phrases worth building into your answers. These signal to the examiner that you are thinking analytically rather than just describing. This suggests that. Use this to link evidence to a conclusion. However, a limitation is, use this to introduce a counterpoint. This can be explained by, use this to apply theory to findings. Supporting evidence comes from, use this to build a coherent argument using more than one study. And the most common mistake students make with Milgram specifically, and with psychology essays generally, is writing a list. A list of what happened, a list of strengths, a list of weaknesses. Examiners do not want lists. They want an argument. Each point should connect to the next. Each paragraph should build on the previous one, and every paragraph should circle back to the question you were asked. That is Milgram's Obedience Study, fully decoded. If this was useful, subscribe to A-Level Decoded. New videos follow this exact playlist order, and every one covers all 3 exam boards together. Next up, the multi-store model of memory. I'll see you there.